The morning sun filtered through gauzy curtains, bathing the kitchen in a soft golden light. Emily Carter moved quietly between the stove and the counter, flipping pancakes the way she had for years. From the outside, it looked like the picture of domestic harmony, a well-kept home, a long marriage, and a family anyone might envy. Her husband, Richard, sat at the table, buried in the morning paper, his coffee untouched. Their exchanges were polite but functional. "Don't forget the grocery list. Your mother called last night." The kind of conversations that filled space without saying much at all. Emily couldn't remember the last time he'd reached across the table to touch her hand. Their son, Michael, was 21, a university student who came home on weekends. He had his father's eyes and her easy smile, though there was a quiet strength in him she couldn't quite place. Emily adored him, though lately she'd noticed subtle changes. He carried himself differently now, more confident, more aware of the way the world looked back at him. That Saturday, Michael arrived earlier than expected, rolling his suitcase into the hall just as Emily was stacking dishes in the cupboard. She smiled, genuinely happy to see him. He hugged her warmly, his embrace lingering a fraction longer than usual. The day unfolded in a familiar rhythm. Laughter over lunch, Michael helping Richard fix a loose cabinet hinge, Emily fussing over whether he'd eaten enough. And yet, beneath the ease of family life, Emily felt an unfamiliar restlessness tugging at her. That evening, as the three of them sat in the living room, Michael cracked a joke that made her laugh harder than she had in weeks. She glanced at Richard, expecting him to share the moment, but he was absorbed in his phone, oblivious. When she looked back at Michael, she found him watching her, his gaze steady and unreadable. She felt a sudden heat in her chest, not shame, not yet, but a disquiet she couldn't name. Later, while folding laundry in the quiet of her bedroom, she caught herself thinking about that look. It had been brief, but something about it had unsettled her. She told herself she was imagining it, that she was only sensitive because she missed the attention she used to have in her marriage. Still, the thought lingered, persistent as a low hum in the back of her mind. As she placed the last folded shirt in the drawer, Emily looked at her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked composed, even content. But deep down, she knew a shift had occurred, subtle yet undeniable. She didn't realize it then, but a single glance had cracked the surface of her carefully built life. And once the crack appeared, it would only widen. Sunday morning arrived warm and bright, sunlight spilling across the hallway like liquid gold. Emily stepped from her bedroom with a towel wrapped loosely around her body, steam still clinging to her skin from the shower. She thought the house was empty. Richard had left early for a golf game, and Michael was nowhere in sight when she'd passed the living room. But as she turned the corner toward her room, she saw him. Michael stood at the far end of the hall, a mug of coffee in his hand. Their eyes met in an instant that felt far too long. The towel slipped from her shoulder, sliding to the floor in one swift motion. For a single heartbeat, neither of them moved. His expression froze, surprise, maybe confusion, but there was something else there too, something unspoken. Emily bent quickly, snatching the towel back around herself, heat flooding her face. "I thought you were still asleep," she managed, her voice catching. He nodded, but said nothing, his gaze darting away. She hurried into her room, closing the door with more force than she intended. Inside, her pulse pounded like a drum. It had been a simple accident, she told herself. Nothing more. Still, she couldn't shake the way his eyes had lingered, or the strange ache that thought left behind. The rest of the day unfolded under an awkward cloud. Over breakfast, conversation was sparse. Michael kept his attention fixed on the newspaper, but Emily noticed him glance at her once, twice, fleeting, almost shy, yet enough to make her chest tighten. That afternoon, they prepared lunch together while Richard was still out. Michael handed her a cutting board, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but her skin tingled as if it had been more. She laughed at something he said, too quickly, too brightly, and saw the corner of his mouth lift in response. In the quiet moments, Emily's mind replayed the hallway scene. She told herself she was overthinking it. that she was simply embarrassed, nothing more. Yet, beneath that rationalization was a dangerous awareness, one she didn't dare name. That evening, as she cleared the dishes, she caught Michael watching her again. His expression was unreadable, but it stirred the same unsettling warmth in her. When Richard returned home, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Casual, routine, familiar, but the undercurrent between her and Michael remained, hidden yet palpable. Lying in bed that night beside her sleeping husband, Emily stared at the ceiling. The memory of the towel on the floor, of Michael's startled gaze, hovered like a secret she hadn't chosen but couldn't forget. In that silence between us, she thought, I should have built a wall. Instead, I left the door open. The weeks that followed should have settled the discomfort between Emily and Michael, but instead, something unspoken began to grow. It was subtle at first, a lingering glance, an extra moment in conversation, a touch that might have been innocent but stayed too long to be forgotten. Michael began visiting more often, sometimes under the pretense of needing a quiet place to study, other times simply passing through. Richard never questioned it. He was glad their son still enjoyed coming home. Emily told herself she was glad too, yet deep down, she knew it wasn't the same kind of gladness. One Saturday afternoon, rain pattered steadily against the windows. Richard had gone to a business meeting, leaving the house quiet except for the soft hum of the television. Michael wandered into the kitchen, finding Emily at the counter chopping vegetables. "Need help?" he asked, his voice casual but warm. She hesitated, then handed him a knife. They worked side by side, their elbows brushing occasionally. Each accidental contact seemed to hum between them, as if the air itself was charged. When their eyes met, neither looked away immediately. Later, they ended up in the living room, watching an old movie. Emily sat curled into the corner of the couch, a blanket over her lap. Michael sat beside her, not too close, not too far, but as the movie played, the distance between them seemed to shrink on its own. Somewhere between the second and third act, Emily felt her head grow heavy and let it rest against the back cushion. When she woke, the credits were rolling, and she found herself leaning against Michael's shoulder. His arm was draped loosely along the back of the couch, his hand only inches from hers. For a moment, neither of them moved. The sound of the rain outside felt louder than it should have been. She sat up quickly, forcing a laugh. "I must have been more tired than I thought." He smiled faintly. "It's fine. I didn't mind." That simple reply sent a shiver down her spine, not because of the words themselves, but the quiet certainty in his tone. That night, lying in bed, Emily replayed the moment over and over. It wasn't physical, not really, but she knew something important had shifted. She was sharing pieces of herself with Michael that she no longer shared with Richard. Her laughter, her quiet moments, her unguarded glances. It was the kind of intimacy that didn't need to be named to be real. I hadn't crossed the line, she thought, but I was standing on it, looking over the edge. By late autumn, the undercurrent between Emily and Michael had become impossible to ignore. What began as subtle glances had evolved into something heavier, an unspoken understanding that lingered in the air whenever they were alone. Richard noticed the change, though he never said it outright. At dinner one evening, his eyes lingered on the way Michael passed Emily the bread, his gaze narrowing slightly before he masked it with a sip of water. Emily felt the weight of that look, but forced herself to smile, as if nothing were wrong. The real breaking point came on a quiet Wednesday afternoon. Michael had stopped by unexpectedly, claiming he'd forgotten a textbook the last time he visited. They ended up in the kitchen, talking over cups of tea. The conversation drifted to her marriage, something Emily had tried to avoid, but the words slipped out anyway. She spoke of loneliness, of feeling invisible. Michael's voice was low when he answered, "You're not invisible to me." The room seemed to shrink, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She didn't respond right away, afraid that saying anything would tip them over the edge. But then he reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers, just enough to make her breath catch. That night, she lay awake replaying the moment. She could feel herself teetering, knowing one wrong step would change everything. The danger wasn't in the physical, not yet, but in how much space he had taken up inside her thoughts. The next day, her phone lit up with a message from Michael. "I can't stop thinking about you." Her hands trembled as she read it. It wasn't poetic, wasn't dressed up in careful words. It was raw, unfiltered, and terrifyingly honest. She stared at the screen for a long time, feeling her heart pull in two directions. When Michael arrived that weekend, she asked him to take a walk with her. The wind was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys. They walked in silence for several minutes before she finally spoke. "This, whatever it is, can't happen," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "You're my son. That will always come first." He stopped walking, his jaw tightening, but he nodded. "I understand," he said quietly. Back at the house, the air felt different, heavier, final. Michael's visits became less frequent after that, and when he did come, the easy laughter they once shared was gone. Richard never asked what had changed. Emily carried the secret alone, knowing it was safer buried than spoken aloud. In quiet moments, the memory of that summer returned. Not with longing, but with the sharp ache of a lesson learned too late. Some betrayals never leave scars you can see, she thought, but they live in the spaces between people, in the silences where love should have been.